want to tell you a story of creation. A second revised story of creation. A famous story of creation. A familiar story. A story of dirt, of earth, of humans, of becoming life. A story of creating trees that are beautiful and also provide fruit. A story of humans and trees. What if we listen to the story from the tree's perspective? What if we heard and save and experience what the trees experienced? Out of the humus, out of that dirt, that deep, rich, dark earth, God formed two trees, creating roots that reached down, that made connections with the fungi below the soil, with trunks and branches that grew up, tall and strong, reaching towards the sky. And on the branches grew leaves, green leaves, that followed the sun, chasing that strength and energy, breathing in the breath of life, breathing up and down, and sending all that carbon down into the roots and into the soil, and spreading it out to the grasses and flowers and bushes and baby trees. It's stored and shared with the carbon, the flowing between all the roots, binding and connecting. God saw those trees, those two mother trees, and saw how beautiful they were, how they worked in the creation, how they nourished and sustained others. Then God shared with creation a garden, and God was pleased. God saw that it was so good and he was pleased. God saw such beauty, saw how good it was, and shared it with the humans. The humans, the one human. The human that might have been two humans back to back, joined together. The human that the God drew out of the humus, the dirt. The human God called dirt. The Adam, the dirt, the man. God saw that human and placed that human in the garden, but God saw that double human that was back to back with itself. Wasn't happy. It had all the animal friends, but it needed a companion, and so God split the human in half, divided it. And those humans were placed in that garden. And said those mother's trees, those beautiful mother trees, the one, the tree of life, the one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, those mother trees don't eat the fruit of those trees. That human called out of that dirt, that human named after that dirt, the way of life growing in dirt. How beautiful, how pleasant, how happy God was, how pleased with life. And God, there in that garden, walked each night with the humans and with the trees. And God said to the humans, you are in charge of all this. And the Adam, the dirt, he decided to name everything. And being that he wasn't always creative, he named his wife also after himself. And God in that garden, with those trees, life and connection, God told humans in this creation story that trees were meant to be pleasant to the sight and then for food. They were to protect those trees, and those trees would guard and shelter them. So how we read this text says a lot about ourselves. And it tells you a lot about the history of the Christian church, because there was no original sin until some Christian in the 5th, 6th century decided that original sin was a thing. That this story isn't about sin. This story is how a farmer would tell you how to grow, how creation came into being. If your life as a farmer was about growing other life, and you wanted to tell how the world started, how would you create your story? How would you share what it's like for the world to begin if what you know is how to farm life? Would your story be about dirt? About how all life grows and comes from dirt? And so I'm not going to talk all about this story, because sometime we will have a series on creation, and I will share the different creation stories and where they come from and how they speak of the people and places and times and science in which they were created. But today I want to talk about mother trees. I've been reading this book, The Search for the Mother Tree. It's by a scientist from Canada whose family comes from a family of loggers in British Columbia. And she says the trees are in her bones. But one of the stories she describes early on is about dirt. She used to love to eat dirt. She talks about how she would know how it would taste and where the sweetest dirt could be found. And when she grew up and wanted to have a job, she couldn't be a logger. So she wanted to learn how to study trees. And so the jobs available were to work for the plantations that grew trees, or to work for the Forest Service. And her first internship during college was with one of those companies that logged the trees. And her job as the budding scientist was to make sure that the plantation trees could thrive. But what she noticed was that they planted all the same kind of tree in rows, and they got rid of everything else around. So that all that was left was those trees, the little baby trees. And what she noticed is that they were mostly all dying. And that started her quest to become a scientist, to figure out why those baby trees were turning yellow and not thriving. What was it that prevented them from growing the way all the trees in the forest where she grew up grew and thrived? And so she set out to discover why. Now, there were a lot of ups and downs in her story, and it's actually, because I don't usually like science books, it's actually pretty interesting if you want to read The Search for the Mother Tree, or Finding the Mother Tree. Because it intersperses her story with the story of trees, her science with the story of her life and what was happening. And so what she discovered along the way, and this is many years along the way through doctoral programs and research grants and first jobs, is that in our forests are big trees, mother trees. Like we have one right on the side of the parking lot over there, a big oak tree. Mother trees are the trees in the forest that help the rest of the trees thrive. So she's one of the first people to make this discovery, and with the help of others who have also been doing it, they discovered the mycorrhizal fungi that live in the ground. And she wanted to know, right, her baby trees all died. And when she pulled them up, the roots had nothing on them. And so when she was out one day in a part of the forest, she pulled up a baby tree and saw that it had all these nodules on it. And so she wanted to know what was different between the baby tree in the plantation and the baby tree in the forest. And so she started studying those nodules. And what she discovered is truffles, by the way. They create huge, yummy truffles. But they create this interconnected web that ties all the trees together. And that those mother trees play an important role in the life of the forest. Because those mother trees send carbon back down into the ground. I mean, they did science experiments, so they radiated the trees, like they used the carbon, different carbon that they would put in so they could track where the carbon went to in the forest. Like from that mother tree, she got radiated, and it would send the carbon out. And what they discovered in all the different experiments is that carbon would go to all the trees around. So it didn't matter if you weren't a fir tree or you weren't a birch tree. The mother tree would send carbon to all of you. But the ones that were related to the mother tree, the ones that actually had her genome, would get a little extra hit. They would get a little bit more carbon, a little bit more nutrients, so that they could survive better. And in all her studies, what she discovered, because this is the time in which climate science it's the 1990s, and climate science was just coming out of the scientific climate area into the greater world, and people were starting to know about it in the scientific community. And so she was wondering how these plantations, which are a monoculture, only planting one tree in rows, and they passed a law in Canada that they were free to grow, an ironic name. The free to grow law was that meant you could destroy everything around the tree. So all the bushes, all the grasses, all the weeds, all the other trees could be removed so that your tree in the plantation could grow, free to grow. What she discovered is with climate change, with the impacts of heat rising, and with the weather patterns changing, whether being too cold or too hot or too rainy or too light, that when those mother trees were still present, when you left the mother trees in the plantation, that they could help the other trees survive negative impacts. That even when they were dying, their last acts were to save their kin. They would send out all the nutrients within themselves to those baby trees. And then because you don't, as a tree, totally disappear, they provided shade for the ones that were in their immediate area. That those mother trees made all these connections that allowed life to survive and thrive. That's the story of Adam and Eve. That's the story of those mother trees. That in that story in Genesis 2:1, 2, and 3, God creates these trees that give life to everything. And then he says, God says. They are pleasant to look at and for food to eat. So the story is about Adam and Eve choosing the wrong half of the sentence, right? That they chose the half that said it's okay to eat. But they forgot the first part of the equation, which are the trees are pleasant to the sight. That when the rabbis argue over it in the Torah, in the Midrash on the Torah, they argue over was part of the problem that they forgot to acknowledge the pleasantness of the trees. They forgot to see the beauty of the trees. Instead, they were consumed by consumption. That they set out and didn't acknowledge the beauty, wonder, and joy of creation. They just ate. And is part of the sin of what is happening here that they forgot about the pleasantness, the prettiness, the joy of the trees, and instead just consumed. And as an aside that would go in another sermon, we think that it's all Eve's fault and she got the worst punishment. But if you read it in the Hebrew, both Eve and Adam are given the punishment of toiling. The woman is punished to toil in childbirth and child rearing. The man is punished to toil in farming. It's the serpent who gets the main punishment. It's the serpent who has the horrible punishments put upon them. But the tree, if you read the very last line, is protected. The tree is saved. The tree has been given its own guardian to remain safe. That's why I thought about these as mother trees, right? That these trees have all these impacts that we aren't aware of. So if we see that this story of Genesis 2 and 3 is about disconnection, about separation, when they take a bite of that tree of life, they make that first step of disconnection. And the whole rest of the story, the whole rest of the Torah is about the humans learning what good and evil are. And writing down the things that are good and saying, this is how we should live our lives. And the stories telling how they fail at that miserably every time you turn around. That tree that was harmed in the story is played out in the scriptures for the rest of the time. Those mother trees gave life and continue to give life to that garden. So in thinking about this, I found a book on trees from the Philippines. And this week, the tree that I was going to read to the kids, but we didn't have any today, was about the Narra tree. Now, some of you all know more about it than me, but that's the Narra tree up there. And it is a mother tree. That if you allow it, so the top image is plantation farming of a Narra tree. Now, what they're discovering is with all the climate impacts happening in the Philippines, they're having trouble with plantation trees, right? Because if you plant just the one species, and you don't have huge giant ones like the two bottom images, when bad things happen, whether it's drought or over rain, the trees in the plantation struggled to survive. And so you can trace how the Narra tree works into Filipino culture through the ages. One of the myths among some of the people, because there are many different traditions and peoples within the Philippines. One of the myths of origin stories is about a flood. And among one of the groups of people in that flood story, it's the Narra tree that saves them. The Narra tree is used, so how many of you have ever seen the images? Some of you may have seen them in person, and you're very lucky. They're not World Heritage Site. They built rice paddies fields into the sides of the mountain. So they terraced these incredibly beautiful rice paddy fields. The Narra tree plays a role in that terracing, in that they created symbols of prosperity, statues that guard the rice paddies and save them and help the rice to grow. Now, the Narra tree has come to symbolize strength and resilience, and it's the national tree of the Philippines, for all of you not from the Philippines. It's the tree that is meant to symbolize their fortitude, meant to symbolize how they can survive through all the waves of colonization that has come through. But the tree itself is starting to play a great role in how do we help to save the islands of the Philippines. Because if we can save the Narra trees, they can help to save the life around them, because they're mother trees. They help to hold together the earth. The roots that they send out, because they're part of the legume family, collect nitrogen. They pull carbon. And they help keep the soil intact and in place. That they are a living example of what a tree of life would be. A tree that grows up strong. And see the flowers? It's pleasant to the sight. That the fruit of the Narra tree isn't actually edible, it flies. It's like these little, some of the trees around here I noticed are starting to get them. They're the big round, and they have like wings, and so they can take off and fly. So it's not actually a to-be-eaten tree. But it's a tree that you notice for its beauty. That when they bud, people go out to see the beauty of the trees. Like right now, the red ones in front of our church, right? And the purple ones that just make you stop in awe. The Narra tree is that mother tree that can help save the people and the place. It can be a force that can be used for conservation. So why do they have plantations of Narra tree? I didn't explain that to you, right? The Narra tree is used for furniture because its heartwood is really strong. Like they call it a type of mahogany. It's a very thick and sturdy tree. So they overgrazed it, right? They cut too many of them down to get the wood because colonization, right? We stole their resources and pushed the wood out into the rest of the world. And cut down many, if not most, of the Narra trees. And so now they're starting to raise them on plantations, but it takes a long time for a Narra tree to get to that point where the wood is as hard and as sturdy as the original Narra trees that you could use for the way the Filipinos built furniture and used it for flooring. And so they're trying to figure out how we can reseed the Narra trees into the Philippines to help save the soil life, to help grow the life that is there. This story from Genesis asks us to think about those mother trees and to think about how sometimes God does create things that are just pleasant for the sight. That God creates a tree so that you can wonder at its beauty. And it doesn't have to be more than that. And if we want our world to thrive and survive, we need to plant these mother trees. Whether it's oak trees like we have in our lot, or Narra trees like in the Philippines. May we this week go out and see the beauty and wonder of the trees. May we stop like God stopped and see how pleasant they are. And then if you want, like my figs, you could probably pick a few. There's a couple lemons, and you could eat from the fruit of that tree. Amen.